It started just after 11:00 p.m. on a quiet Wednesday night in Toledo, Ohio, the kind of late hour when the roads are mostly empty except for a few night shift workers heading home. Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Morgan was one of them. She'd just wrapped up a long meeting at Fort Wayne, Indiana, 2 hours south, and was making her way back in a standard-issue black government SUV. The vehicle wasn't flashy, just clean, solid, and official, much like the woman driving it. Celeste wasn't speeding, weaving, or doing anything unusual, but that didn't matter to Sergeant Derek Slater. Parked on the shoulder of Reynolds Road, sipping stale gas station coffee and scrolling his phone in boredom, Slater saw the unfamiliar SUV and saw something else. An opportunity to assert control. Without cause, he pulled out, flicked on his lights, and lit up the quiet street in red and blue. Celeste remained calm. Years of military training had taught her how to respond to pressure without panic. She slowed down, pulled over, and waited, with her hands visible on the steering wheel. Slater approached fast, flashlight in one hand, the other resting casually on his holstered sidearm. No greeting, no explanation, just a curt, "License and registration." Celeste rolled her window halfway and asked calmly, "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" His reply was clipped. "You were drifting between lanes, possible DUI." Celeste knew she hadn't drifted at all. She wasn't drinking, wasn't distracted, but she didn't argue. Yet. As she reached for her documents, she stated clearly, "This is a government vehicle. I'm a federal employee." Slater didn't flinch. "That doesn't put you above the law." His voice grew more forceful, and without probable cause he demanded she exit the vehicle. That's when Celeste quietly hit record on her phone. If she hadn't served 22 years in the Army, she might have panicked, but she knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about safety, it was about power, and she understood all too well how quickly things could escalate when someone in a badge saw authority not as a duty but as a weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Morgan had faced far more dangerous situations than a late-night traffic stop. She'd led convoys through unstable zones overseas, coordinated disaster relief under crushing pressure, and made life-or-math calls that most civilians would never understand. So when Sergeant Derek Slater approached her vehicle with an aggressive tone and a hand hovering near his weapon, she didn't panic. She prepared. Her years of military service had sharpened a skill set most people never develop. Calm under fire, clarity in chaos. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply followed protocol. Hands visible, voice steady, she responded with the same measured discipline she expected from her own soldiers, even as Slater escalated the situation, demanding she exit her vehicle without offering reasonable cause. Celeste remained composed. She questioned his orders respectfully, not to defy him but to ensure legality and transparency. When he insisted again, louder this time, she didn't resist. Instead, she reached over and quietly activated her phone camera. "Just so we're clear," she said evenly, "this interaction is being documented." That simple sentence wasn't a threat. It was a boundary, and though Slater flinched for a second, his pride kept him from backing down. As she stepped out of the SUV, Celeste carried herself with the kind of presence that didn't need a uniform to command respect. Civilian clothes couldn't conceal what she was: a leader, a protector, someone who had spent over 2 decades earning every stripe on her sleeve. She complied with every field sobriety test he threw at her, walking the line, standing still, following instructions. She didn't waver, didn't slip, didn't slur a single word. But Slater, locked in his authority complex, wrote her a citation anyway, for failure to maintain lane. Celeste didn't argue. She simply accepted the ticket, returned to her vehicle, and drove away. But deep down she knew this wasn't over, not because she wanted revenge, but because silence, in moments like this, could too easily become complicity, and that wasn't something she could allow, not for herself, and not for those she served beside every day. Sergeant Derek Slater had been with the Toledo Police Department for 15 years. He was the kind of officer who clocked in early, filled out his reports on time, and never missed a court date. His uniform was always pressed, his boots always shined, and his tone always sharp. But beneath the surface of discipline and procedure, there was something else, something unspoken, that most of his colleagues had learned to tolerate. Slater carried himself like a man who believed the badge made him untouchable. To rookies, he was a figure of authority. To peers, he was efficient, if a little hard-edged. To those on the receiving end of his traffic stops or citations, he was intimidating. Quick to escalate, slow to listen. Years of being protected by the system had shaped Slater into someone who no longer questioned his own judgment. Supervisors had looked the other way when complaints were filed, union reps had smoothed over disciplinary reviews, and every time a civilian pushed back, the department backed him up. That reinforcement built a sense of invincibility, a belief that whatever he did behind the wheel of a squad car would never truly be challenged. He didn't see race, he didn't see rank, he saw obedience, and anything less than that was a threat to his authority. On the night he pulled over Celeste Morgan, he didn't recognize the weight of the name she handed him. He didn't care that she was in a government-issued vehicle. All he saw was a woman who didn't immediately submit to his tone. That was enough to trigger his need for control. The fact that she questioned him, even politely, rubbed him the wrong way. He saw it as defiance, not professionalism. That's how Slater operated. Every stop was a power play, every challenge a personal affront. In the break room the next day, he laughed about it like it was nothing. "She flashed her little government badge," he told a colleague. "Thought that would impress me." But what Slater didn't know, what his ego blinded him from seeing, was that this time the rules were about to change, and he wouldn't be the one writing the report. Celeste Morgan had never been the kind of person to chase conflict, but she had also never been the kind to let injustice slide. After more than 2 decades in uniform, she'd learned that silence doesn't keep you safe, it just protects the wrong people. So when she returned to Fort Wayne the morning after the stop, running on less than 3 hours of sleep and a head full of replayed moments, she didn't rant or react impulsively. She acted with purpose. First, she reviewed the video she had recorded from her phone. Then she contacted her base legal counsel, the Inspector General's office, and finally her military chain of command. Her message wasn't emotional. It was precise, documented, and backed by evidence. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't need to. Her decision to report the incident wasn't just about her. It was about every soldier she had ever mentored, every woman, especially every black woman, who had ever been dismissed, questioned, or disrespected for daring to ask why. Celeste had seen too many young service members internalize their pain just to keep the peace. She had advised others to speak up when something felt wrong. Now it was her turn to follow that same advice. What made her different wasn't just her rank or experience, it was how she moved. Quietly, strategically. No press conferences, no angry posts. Just a focused series of phone calls, formal complaints, and unshakable facts. She submitted everything to the appropriate authorities, knowing the wheels of accountability often turn slowly, but they do turn, especially when the right people are watching. Meanwhile, Sergeant Slater remained unaware that a formal inquiry had been triggered. The video she'd captured was already circulating within military legal circles, and a copy had been sent to the Department of Justice. By the time he would realize the gravity of his actions, it wouldn't be whispers, it would be subpoenas. Celeste wasn't looking to destroy someone's career, she was demanding something more powerful. A record, a line in the sand. A clear reminder that no one is above consequence and that professionalism doesn't mean silence. It means knowing when to speak, how to act, and who to hold accountable. The courtroom wasn't filled with reporters or flashing cameras, at least not yet, but inside the air was thick with something heavier than headlines. Accountability. The case of Morgan v. Slater wasn't just another civil suit about a traffic stop gone wrong. It had become a quiet but powerful test of justice. One that asked whether authority figures could be held responsible when they abused the power they were entrusted with. Celeste Morgan didn't arrive in court for drama or revenge. She arrived in uniform, not just to make a statement, but to remind the jury and everyone watching that her service, her discipline, and her integrity had never wavered. She wasn't a victim looking for sympathy. She was a soldier asking for fairness. When she took the stand, she didn't speak with outrage, she spoke with precision. Her testimony was supported by clear video footage from both her phone and Slater's body cam. It showed a compliant driver asking fair questions, treated with suspicion and hostility. The jury watched in silence as the recordings played. Every clipped command, every dismissive gesture, every moment Slater had the chance to de-escalate and chose not to, it was all there, frame by frame. The defense tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, protocol taken too far. But Celeste made it clear, protocol without reason is just harassment in a uniform. Her line, "That badge isn't a free pass, it's a responsibility," hung in the air long after she said it. Slater never testified. He just sat, rigid and stone-faced, while his attorney did the talking. But his silence spoke volumes. He had underestimated who he pulled over that night. Not just her title, but her willingness to see this through. In the end, it wasn't about one night on an empty road. It was about the broader question, what happens when power goes unchecked? And when someone finally says, "Enough," will the system listen? For once, the answer was yes, and the verdict would soon prove it. When Celeste Morgan stepped into the courtroom wearing her full military service uniform, the atmosphere shifted. Her medals glinted under the fluorescent lights, her posture unshakable. She didn't come to court to perform, she came to tell the truth. Every ribbon on her chest represented years of sacrifice, leadership, and quiet strength. But for Sergeant Derek Slater, seated stiffly at the defense table, it was the first time he truly saw her, not as the difficult woman he'd pulled over, but as the decorated officer whose rights he had trampled without a second thought. As the trial unfolded, the facts came into focus, like a lens sharpening in real time. The jury heard Celeste speak, calm, deliberate, clear. She wasn't angry, she was resolute. Her voice never wavered as she described how Slater had escalated a routine stop without cause, demanded she exit her vehicle, and treated her with suspicion despite her full cooperation. Then came the footage. First her phone's clear recording, then Slater's own body cam. The contrast was striking. Her composure only highlighted his aggression. Even in silence, the jury saw everything they needed. The defense tried to deflect. They asked if Slater was just doing his job, if he acted out of safety concerns. But Celeste's answers were grounded in facts. She hadn't swerved. She wasn't intoxicated. She complied every step of the way. "I recorded the stop," she said, "because I've lived long enough to know silence doesn't protect anyone." That line landed. Even the judge paused. When the prosecution asked Slater why he made her exit the vehicle, his response was telling. "She looked evasive," he said, "but she hadn't disobeyed a single command." When asked if he would have acted differently had he known her rank, he admitted, "Probably." That moment pierced the room. It wasn't about safety, it was about assumptions. In that courtroom, the badge didn't shield Slater, the truth did the talking. And in the eyes of the jury, justice wasn't just a concept, it was a decision waiting to be made. The courtroom was quieter on the day the verdict was read, no uniforms lining the benches, no crowd of curious onlookers, just Celeste Morgan, her attorney, and a few civilians who had followed the case from the beginning. Derek Slater sat across the aisle, his hands clasped, jaw set like concrete. For once, he wasn't in control. Judge Cynthia Morales shuffled the verdict papers before looking up. "In the matter of Morgan v. Slater," she began, "the jury has found in favor of the plaintiff." A beat of silence followed. No gasp, no celebration, just a shift in the air as the weight of consequence settled. The court found that Slater had violated Celeste Morgan's constitutional rights during an unlawful stop and detainment. His actions were deemed inconsistent with both department policy and the standards of professional conduct expected from any law enforcement officer. The court awarded Celeste $35,000, 0 cents in damages, but more importantly, the ruling would be added to the department's permanent record and forwarded to the Department of Justice for further review. Slater's attorney leaned over and whispered about filing an appeal, but even he didn't sound convinced. Outside the courthouse, a few local reporters had gathered. Slater said nothing. He covered his face with a folder and walked briskly to his car, no longer the man behind the badge, just another defendant facing the repercussions of unchecked power. Celeste, meanwhile, received the court notification on her phone. "Verdict in your favor, case closed." She didn't smile, didn't gloat. It was never about the money. It was about standing firm in the face of misconduct and ensuring the record told the truth. A week later, Slater was placed on administrative leave pending internal investigation. Rumors circled about reassignment or termination. Either way, his shield of invincibility had cracked, and the silence that once protected him had finally turned into a spotlight. At Fort Wayne, Celeste returned to her duties. Quietly, steadily. Her victory wasn't about making noise, it was about making change, and now the system had been forced to listen. Celeste Morgan never sought the spotlight. She wasn't interested in headlines, hashtags, or viral moments. Her focus was always on the mission, on leadership, discipline, and setting an example. But as she stood before a room of new recruits at Fort Wayne 2 months after the verdict, she knew this moment called for something more personal. She wasn't there to lecture on tactics or logistics. She was there to talk about something harder to teach: integrity when no one's watching. Looking out across a sea of young, hopeful faces, she asked a simple question: how many of you think a uniform automatically earns you respect? A few hands went up. She nodded slowly and replied, "I understand why you'd think that, but here's the truth. Respect isn't something you're owed, it's something you prove. Every day, every choice." She didn't mention the case. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried the weight of lived experience. Power, she continued, isn't a shield, it's a responsibility, and if you can't carry it with discipline, you shouldn't carry it at all. The room was quiet. Not out of boredom, but reflection. They had read the news. They had whispered about the court case. Now, they were hearing the lesson behind it directly from the woman who lived it. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She spoke with the same quiet conviction she had shown the night she was pulled over and the day she took the stand. Her point was clear. Authority without accountability is just arrogance in uniform. And silence? Silence is comfort for the guilty. She closed her folder, glanced across the room one last time, and said, "Speak up. Stand firm. And when you see something wrong, don't turn away. Because leadership isn't about being loud. It's about being right when it matters most." Then she stepped down. Not for applause, but because the message had been delivered. Her voice might not echo through headlines, but it echoed through every soldier in that room. And sometimes the quietest stance is the one that changes everything. For Celeste Morgan, the courtroom victory wasn't the final chapter, it was only a beginning. While the verdict had affirmed what she already knew to be true, that her rights had been violated, that her calm professionalism had exposed a deeper failure in the system, she understood that real change doesn't come from a single ruling. It comes from what happens afterward. She didn't return to base seeking applause or recognition. She slipped quietly back into her duties, leading her unit with the same focus and integrity that had defined her career. But within the ranks, the message was loud and clear: dignity doesn't have to shout to make an impact. What happened that night in Toledo had happened to others before her, people without a camera, without a rank, without the resources to fight back. That's why Celeste knew she had to carry the outcome forward, not just as a personal victory, but as a call to leadership. She began mentoring more intentionally, speaking one-on-one with younger officers and soldiers about what it means to hold power responsibly, not through lectures, but through lived example. Meanwhile, Derek Slater's name faded from headlines but remained under review. He returned to duty weeks later, but with closer supervision and fewer assumptions about his authority. The badge he once wielded like a weapon now carried the weight of public scrutiny. Celeste didn't need to see his downfall. That was never the goal. What she wanted, and what she achieved, was to make the system pause, reflect, and correct. Because the courtroom may deliver a verdict, but accountability lives in what we choose to do after the gavel falls. In her world, leadership wasn't about punishment, it was about purpose, and she was far from finished. One of the most powerful lessons from Celeste Morgan's story is that dignity doesn't require volume, it requires conviction. In a world where too many people in authority misuse their power, her calm, measured response reminds us that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, the most lasting impact comes from standing firm, without raising your voice. For older generations who have lived through decades of social change, this story is a timely reminder. We've seen progress, but we must still be vigilant. Justice is not automatic. It must be pursued with integrity, even when it's inconvenient. And speaking up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means documenting the truth, following protocol, and trusting the process to reveal what's right. Celeste didn't fight for headlines, she fought for accountability. Her story teaches us that age, status, or experience don't exempt anyone from being challenged, but they also equip us to handle those moments with wisdom. So whether you're a veteran, a retired teacher, or a grandparent guiding the next generation, remember this: real leadership is lived, not claimed. And when silence protects the wrong people, it's time to stand, firmly, respectfully, and without fear. Because dignity, at any age, is worth defending.